You ever look at those letters from the IRS and just feel this weight of authority?
Yeah,
Like they have this universal get your money card.
definitely. It feels that way.
Well, today we're grabbing a magnifying glass and taking a much closer look at that card. We've got a fascinating pile of stuff here, some Federal Register notices, some deep dives into the history of income tax,
And that book.
and even a rather eyebrow-raising book called The Great IRS Hoax,
You're right.
Our Mission, to figure out if the IRS is this all-powerful entity with unlimited reach, or maybe if their power operates within a more specific set of rules.
Yeah, understanding the actual framework.
It's about understanding the game, not getting played by it.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Are they the cops with, like, a general warrant for everyone? Or are they more like a collections agency working within certain boundaries? Now, we're not here to give legal advice, obviously.
No, definitely not.
But we want to unpack how these sources suggest the IRS functions, as a collection arm within a particular legal framework rather than some blanket authority over every single person.
Aiming for clarity.
We're aiming for light bulb moments, yeah, not head-scratching confusion.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So we're going to explore how the IRS seems to operate as a collection agency, maybe peek at this intriguing idea of the straw man.
That one's interesting.
Untangle some of the mysteries of Title 26. That's the Internal Revenue Code, by the way.
The big book of tax rules.
And maybe even debunk a tax myth or two along the way. We'll also look at why your involvement in what they call commerce might be more relevant than just, being a citizen.
It's a key distinction in these arguments.
Sounds like a puzzle, right? Let's try and put the pieces together. And remember our little saying for today.
Yes.
We're not teaching law, we're teaching life.
Okay, let's dive into these Federal Register notices first, because, if the IRS had this broad, unquestionable authority.
You'd expect something different.
Yeah, you might expect these documents to be like grand pronouncements from on high. Instead, what do we actually see?
Lots of details.
A lot of very specific, dare I say, administrative details. We're talking rules for partnerships, how to handle taxes on digital content, even corrections to existing regulations under something called Subchapter K.
Right. It's like reading the instruction manual for a very specific piece of machinery, isn't it?
Holy!
We're seeing titles like Administrative Requirements for an Election to Exclude Applicable Unincorporated Organizations from the Application of Subchapter K. Sounds thrilling, I know.
Visiting stuff.
But what's interesting is how targeted it all feels.
Yeah.
It's not a general decree for all mankind to, send in their lunch money.
Precisely. These are the nitty-gritty details of how to administer very particular parts of the tax code. And notice this too.
What's that?
The Taxpayer Advocacy Panel holds open meetings. They're actively asking for public feedback on how to improve their customer service.
Customer service. That word choice is interesting, isn't it?
It really is. It suggests a service being provided, maybe a transaction happening, rather than just a demand being issued by some unchallengeable power.
Okay, now let's switch gears slightly. Let's bring in the great IRS hoax. This might raise a few eyebrows. It throws out this idea that Subtitle A of the Internal Revenue Code, the main income tax part, is essentially private law or special law.
Okay.
Their argument is it only kicks in if you agree to play by their rules. How? By engaging in what they call an excise taxable activity.
Right, and they define that.
Which they define as trade or business.
Yeah.
And get this, they equate that to holding a public office.
Yeah.
Unpack that for us. What's the gist of this public office idea?
Well, the core of their argument, as they interpret various legal bits and pieces, seems to be that if you're not involved in this specific federal office privilege,
Right.
then Subtitle A, the part most people think of as general income tax.
The one we all know and love, or don't.
Exactly that one. It doesn't automatically apply to you. They see it as a tax on the benefit, the privilege, of participating in certain federal government-related activities.
And based on this logic, they suggest some rather, unusual ways to respond to the IRS.
Like what?
Like using a W-8SUB form instead of the usual W-4, or even submitting an identity theft affidavit if the collection folks come knocking.
Okay, so the idea there is...
The idea seems to be you're saying, hey, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for this particular club, so those membership fees don't apply to me.
Right. That's the underlying logic they present. They're trying to disconnect themselves from what they perceive as a voluntary participation in a specific federal system.
Okay.
Now, here's a crucial point from the great IRS hoax. They emphasize that they aren't necessarily saying the tax laws themselves are illegal or unconstitutional. That's not the argument.
So what is the argument?
Instead, they're arguing that these laws are being misapplied to people who aren't the intended target, according to their interpretation.
So it's not about blowing up the tax system entirely, but about understanding who they believe the system was actually built for.
Exactly. It's a very specific reading of the law and who it applies to.
It's definitely a different way of looking at things, to say the least. Okay, first layer of the onion peeled, I think.
Feels like it.
We're not teaching law, we're teaching life.
Now, let's venture into the somewhat more abstract territory, straw man theory, and how the great IRS hoax tries to connect it to Title 26.
Right, the straw man.
They introduced this concept of a public you, which they called the straw man, basically a legal creation, a fiction,
Okay.
versus the private you, the actual flesh and blood human being.
The straw man idea. It's like we each have this legal doppelganger floating around in the system.
Kind of, yeah.
And that's the one that interacts with the government and gets all the official mail. So when the IRS sends a letter to John Q. Public, they're not talking to me, the guy drinking coffee right now.
But to this paper version of you, that's the assertion they make. They argue that government laws often attach to this public entity, this legal fiction.
Which they believe is created somehow.
They often point to things like birth certificates as the start of its creation, and the remedies they propose, like trying to reclaim your private status, are all about trying to separate the real person from these obligations they believe are tied only to the public straw man.
And this is where Title 26 supposedly comes in. How does that link up?
Well, they argue that the Internal Revenue Code, Title 26, is being kind of twisted and unfairly enforced against folks who haven't willingly stepped into this public role.
How does that work, according to them?
Their argument, again, is that Title 26 is really meant for those involved in that specific federal trade or business franchise we talked about earlier.
The public office idea.
Exactly. And they point to what they call word games in the definitions within Title 26 itself.
Word games.
Yeah.
Like,
They look at terms like citizen, individual, person, and taxpayer, suggesting these aren't just everyday words, but have very specific, limited legal meanings within that federal system.
oh, okay.
They even make the claim that the word shall, which most of us think means must, in many places in Title 26, should actually be read as may.
Implying it's voluntary.
Implying a voluntary action rather than a mandatory one. Yeah, that's their interpretation.
Wow. And they dig into specific parts of Title 26 too, right?
They do. They look at Section 1, which talks about the tax being imposed, Section 61 on gross income, Section 861 about where income comes from source rules, and Section 871 dealing with taxes on non-resident aliens. Their whole argument is that these sections, the way they read them, are really aimed at a much smaller group.
Not everyone.
Not everyone. Mainly those connected to that federal trade or business, or those classified under the code as non-resident alien individuals.
It's a very specific, shall we say, niche interpretation of the entire tax code.
It absolutely is. It challenges the mainstream understanding fundamentally.
Okay, deep breath again. This is a lot to take in.
It is.
We're not teaching law, we're teaching life.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and look at some history. We've got info from the Constitution Center, the American Battlefield Trust, and even the IRS's own historical highlights.
Right. Because it's easy to think income tax is just, always been here, this solid, unchanging thing.
But its story in the U.S. has had its ups and downs, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. We learned that way back during the Civil War, 1861, Lincoln brought in the first national income tax.
Primarily war funding.
Mostly to pay for the war, exactly.
Okay.
But it didn't last, did it?
No, it got repealed about a decade later. It was seen more as a temporary emergency measure.
And then when they tried to bring it back later...
The Supreme Court stepped in, the Pollock decision.
Okay.
They said, nope, that's unconstitutional.
Why?
Because they ruled it was a direct tax, and the Constitution said direct taxes had to be apportioned, divvied up based on the population of each state.
And they weren't doing that.
They weren't doing that. So that was a pretty significant roadblock for a federal income tax.
And then comes the big one, the famous 16th Amendment in 1913. That's the one everyone points to as legalizing income tax, right?
That's the common understanding, yes. It gave Congress the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment.
But guess what? The great IRS hoax has its own take on that, too.
Of course it does. What do they say?
They suggest it wasn't meant to tax every regular American. Their interpretation is it was really meant to allow Congress to tax non-resident alien individuals without needing to do that whole apportionment thing.
Ah, so that fits right back into their argument about who Title 26 is actually aimed at.
Exactly. It ties into their focus on domicile and whether you're connected to those specific federal privileges or seen as outside that system.
Interesting historical footnote. Even the Confederacy had an income tax during the Civil War.
Really? How'd that go?
Apparently, it wasn't nearly as effective at bringing in the cash as the Union system. Collection was a big problem.
And even the IRS itself, in its own history notes.
Yeah, they're historical highlights.
It mentions that the Bureau of Internal Revenue became the IRS in 1953, and it specifically calls itself a service agency.
That word service again.
Right. It keeps popping up. It seems to reinforce this idea of a particular function being performed, maybe for specific customers, not just a general power being wielded over everyone.
So this whole idea that just because you're a citizen, you automatically owe income tax.
Yeah.
According to the Great IRS Hoax, that's a big misunderstanding. It's based on how they define trade or business and where you're legally considered to be domiciled or based.
It's about a specific connection, in their view, not just general citizenship.
That's the argument they build.
Okay, history lesson check. That was interesting.
It adds context.
And remember, we're not teaching law, we're teaching life.
Which leads us neatly into what the Great IRS Hoax argues is maybe the key distinction here: commerce versus citizenship. Their main point, boiled down, is that the Subtitle A income tax isn't really about simply being a citizen living in one of the states.
It's not about just being here.
Not according to them. Instead, they say it's tied to actively engaging in commerce through this specific trade or business franchise.
Which, again, they link to holding a public office.
Right. That connection is central to their entire thesis.
So, in their view, the obligation to pay this particular type of income tax comes from, voluntarily participating in this federal system, this franchise.
Yes, voluntarily availing yourself of that federal privilege.
Rather than just existing as an American within the 50 states, it's like saying you only pay the toll if you actually drive on the toll road.
That's a decent analogy for their perspective. If you don't use that specific federal service or privilege being offered, you're not obligated for that specific fee or tax associated with it.
And they actually advocate for specific status based on this.
They do. They advocate for what they term a non-resident alien status for American nationals living in the 50 states who don't have income directly from the government or aren't involved in this trade or business franchise.
Wait, non-resident alien, even if you live here, how does that work?
They argue that within the specific framework of Title 26, if you're not part of that particular federal system, the trade or business public office system, you are treated as someone non-resident to that system for those particular tax purposes.
That's quite a claim.
It's definitely a claim that challenges conventional labels. And they even bring Social Security into it.
How so?
They suggest Social Security might be one mechanism by which individuals get drawn into this taxpayer status, connecting it somehow to being recruited into this trade or business franchise structure.
So, like a subtle enrollment process into a system that then comes with these tax obligations.
That seems to be the implication they're making. It's certainly a perspective that makes you rethink the fundamental reasons behind income tax, or at least how this particular source frames it.
Yeah, it really does. All right, my brain is officially full now.
Mine too. It's dense material.
Okay, one last time to this section. We're not teaching law, we're teaching life.
So let's try and quickly recap the main threads we pulled on today.
Good idea.
We've explored the idea, drawn from these sources, that the IRS might function more like a collection agency for specific federal activities.
Right, rather than just a general tax authority over everyone.
We've looked at the concepts of strawman theory and how the Great IRS Hoax connects it to Title 26 definitions and alleged enforcement issues.
And the whole public you versus private you idea.
Exactly. We've revisited the history of income tax in the U.S., noting its somewhat bumpy ride and some alternative interpretations of the 16th Amendment presented in the book.
Yeah, that was eye-opening.
And finally, we've examined the argument, central to the Great IRS Hoax, that tax obligations under Subtitle A might be more closely tied to engaging in federal commerce through a trade or business franchise than simply to your status as a citizen of a state.
It certainly gives you a lot to, ponder. it makes you wonder about the real basis of your own tax obligations, doesn't it?
It does raise questions.
Is it just because you live and work in America? Or is there something more specific, maybe more of a voluntary connection to a particular federal system at play? These are the kinds of questions that pop up when you start looking at these alternative viewpoints.
And again, we're just presenting what these sources say.
Absolutely. We definitely encourage you to do your own homework, dig into these ideas yourself, read the sources if you can, and think critically about what you find.
Absolutely. Because ultimately, understanding these different perspectives, even if you completely disagree with them,
Right.
it can empower you to be a more informed and engaged individual when you encounter these systems.
Well said. And with that final thought,
We're not teaching law, we're teaching life.